welcome after the break. Hope you had a great lunch and warm greetings and words of gratitude to our Finnish hosts. The lunch was really great. My name is Adrian Bucałowski. I came here from Poland, where I work as a Deputy Director of Civil Protection Department at the national headquarters of the State Fire Service. For many years, I've been also a volunteer, working for civic volunteering issues, and I was also a journalist who was really interested in fire service and all related issues. In this session, together with our experts, I will have a privilege to guide you through different perspectives on new and persistent societal security challenges. Today's topic is relevant to every one of us in this room. To feel safe and secure is one of the basic needs of every individual, and safety and security has many dimensions, with some of them emphasized even more this year. And this year is not only about war in Ukraine and its implications to Europe and the world, although they are crucial. The military conflict is neighboring us. Our societies, and probably even you, think whether this conflict would spill beyond Ukraine. And even if it's not about rockets falling on our territories, it might be about other intentional events taking place in physical and virtual space. And it's already a tragedy and challenge for direct and indirect victims of this conflict. More than 12.6 million people left Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict. And more than 7.2 million of them stays in various European countries. So it's more than the population of Finland. Disruptions are visible in other sectors too. Governments and individuals in many countries are struggling with securing energy supplies before the winter season. The prices are rising. Tensions in the societies are rising. Could you imagine that instability of Ukrainian and Russian agriculture can lead to famine in many countries in Africa and Asia that are very much dependent on imported seeds and other farming products from Eastern Europe? And what about cultural heritage that is destroyed in Ukraine, also in an attempt to demolish identity of the Ukrainian nation? Remember that access to culture is also a human need. But as I said, this year is not only about war. Do you know that this summer we had the biggest drought in Europe since 16th century? In August, 47% of the European soil was completely dried up. Would water become a luxury good in the future Europe? It's already in some parts of the world, and wars on the access to water are on the rise. And what about forest fires that in recent years required some of the Baltic Sea Region countries to call for international assistance? We slowly forget about COVID. But is it the last pandemic that we will experience? Biological factors can actually be used by enemy to destabilize societies and economies. And in many parts of the world, human settlements are being set up closer and closer to wild natural environments, increasing the risk of human contact with infectious agents we are not immune to. In globalized, traveling world, it's extremely difficult to spread the disease. And again, implications are wide. And people do not feel secure not only because of the risk to their health, but also because of risks to their rights they possess. But risk is coming not only from big crises or imminent and slow onset disasters. Feeling of safety and security can be disrupted also by day-to-day emergencies. whether they relate to criminal activities or, for example, fires, accidents, or drownings. Today, we are meeting at the annual forum of the EU strategy for the Baltic Sea region. Safety and security has been the area of the interest of the strategy from the very beginning. Already more than 10 years ago, we did international projects that helped to assess major risks in the Baltic Sea region. What's more, we supported governments with guidance on how to assess level of resilience against identified risks. Recently, we even developed toolbox for city mayors that might support them in decision-making related to risk management. We also have risk-specific projects. We have projects, for example, assessing efficiency of awareness-raising campaigns. And finally, we have projects focused on or benefiting from participating of stakeholders from different sectors. We found out that in order to achieve safety and security for society, we actually need whole of society response. We are conducting projects with academia. We are recently promoting businesses that can support civil security with innovative solutions. And finally, we are focusing also on volunteers and even children and youth. And one of the workshops on the role of children in building resilience has been conducted 2 days ago on the margins of this forum. Because of that, for today's session, experts from different fields have been invited. Not only government, but also academia and private sector is represented. Let me introduce you to our speakers. Professor Sten Widmalm, who is a professor in political science at the Department of Government of Uppsala University. Professor Zbigniew Lasocik, who works at the Human Trafficking Studies Center at the University of Warsaw. Līga Raita Rozentāle, who is a senior director for European Governmental Affairs at Corporate, External and Legal Affairs of Microsoft. And Jari Honkanen, senior specialist in the EU and International Affairs Unit of Department for Rescue Services of the Ministry of Interior of Finland. Before I give the floor to our first speaker, let me encourage you, so our audience, to prepare questions, as our session will also include Q&A part. We'll go with questions from microphone later on. Okay, so first we will start with presenting results from latest research that was done in Sweden. Professor Widmalm will introduce us to the Open Society project that dealt with very difficult, but at the same time very important challenge between security and freedom. I wonder what would be your opinions to questions that were raised during this project. Professor, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to this panel today and letting me present some research results which I have produced with my colleague Thomas Persson at Uppsala University. We have a project called the Open Society, and it's supported by several authorities in Sweden, research councils and such things. So these are the funders, so you know where the money comes from. I'm going to talk about today how to protect freedom and why this is important in relationship to some of the topics that some of the other speakers will speak more about here later. When we talk about having a more secure society and providing security for states, we think about protection from hostile states, and we think a lot about protection from extremists within the country, at least from a political science perspective. And then you have natural hazards and such things as well, of course. But we also know a lot. I mean, there are many there are many ways to speak for democracy as an intrinsic value. But it also turns out that democracies are better at responding to crisis because there is a better flow of information in such countries, and we hopefully all support the idea of democracy. So in this project, we focus more on what's in the heads of the citizens, because this is where we find the most important line of defense for security and democracy at the same time, right? And we are very much inspired by Karl Popper, by his theorizing on how to reach knowledge, all those things that he wrote about after the Second World War. It provides us with a good methodology and the maps that we need to do thorough empirical investigations without getting stuck in relativistic perspectives too much and so on, such things. But he said that it rests with us to improve matters. The democratic institutions cannot improve themselves. The problem of improving them is always a problem of persons rather than institutions. And this is a bit controversial for some of us, because we think about when we want to provide security, we just want to strengthen institutions, right? We just want to build a stronger society, a stronger state, and stronger protections and things like that. But there is always the risk for a contradiction, that you actually destroy freedoms at the same time. And you really want to be careful with that, because there's such values within this, in the heads of the citizens are fragile, and they take a long time to build, and they are easily torn down. So we have a couple of publications here in this project right now. We have a qualitative study called Fragile Democracy, where we study, for example, cancel culture, freedom of academia, freedom of media, how states in democracies try to provide norm culture and norm steering, we call it, to a large extent, and how that affects certain freedoms. And then we are working with Gothenburg University to do surveys to probe the minds of the citizens. We have representative samples from the whole population in Sweden, which we work with. And that's what I'm going to be talking mostly now about, very quickly though, because we want to listen to the other ones afterwards here, of course. So first, on freedom, security, and the will to defend the country. Everybody wants freedom, of course. Everybody answered that in the questionnaires. But when we ask the respondents to choose between freedom versus security, then we can see that 57% say they chose security, and only 43 chose freedom. So this is a way of, and for us this is a key, because this is very important, because if you don't have security, I mean, security is fundamental here for shaping other views that democracy depends on, and we'll come to that. When it comes to support for military defense in crisis, we can see that to a relatively high degree or a very high degree, we have support for a military defense in Sweden, which is the two rightward staples there. We have 40% supporting a military defense. I think it's much greater in Finland, but let's say that is okay. But here we have a huge gender difference. Women are only half the number of women are willing to support a military defense in a crisis compared to men. Civil defense support is much higher, 60%, and then that means that the difference between genders is much lower, of course. And when it comes to cooperating with emergency services in a crisis, there's very good support for that in Sweden. We are very happy to say that, because you may have heard about the Eastern riots this year, when 300 policemen were hurt over 4 days in Sweden in areas with high levels of immigrants in it. It was a complete breakdown for 4 days. And this is reflected if we look at, if you have a background as an immigrant, then there's a tendency not to trust the emergency services if you compare to the rest of the population. But in general, the support for the emergency services is very high in Sweden. So that is good. Preparedness and the willingness to support even the army. Oh, it could be better, I suppose, but there is something there that it's not breaking, that we can't see breakdown or anything like that, fortunately, at least. But then we took a look at two things that I'm just gonna talk about here, and that is, what about political tolerance and self-censorship? What is the quality of the Swedish democracy and the climate for an open debate and for being, for wanting to extend rights to others, even those that we don't like, provided that they're not Nazis or openly fascists and such. So we went out and we measured political tolerance in the Swedish population. And this can be done by asking people first what is the most disliked group in society, and then we asked to what extent should that person have certain rights. So that's what we did. We provided a list of people belonging to certain groups: feminists, anti-vaxxers, Christian Democrats, animal activists, hunters, vegans, socialists, etc. So we had all these options for people to pick here, and then people picked the group they disliked the most. And this is the first result for that. We had expected antagonism to be reflected against immigrants, for example, anti-Muslim sentiment, such things. But the good news is that when it comes to ethnic minorities in Sweden, they are not selected very much or not at all in the most disliked group. You can have homosexuals here, almost not measured anything against them there. Feminists, no problem. Men, not very much. Women are not even mentioned by anyone, and so on. But when you come up to immigrants, 2%, and then Muslims 5%. But if you go to the top of the line here, you can see that the most disliked group is Sweden Democrats, the far-right party, members of the far-right party. And then you have anti-vaxxers and those who are not supporting the right to abortion. Now, as soon as we say this, a lot of people lose interest in this list, because in Sweden at least, because they feel like, well, I mean, those guys, why should we support their rights? But this is very important, because we're not saying that the views should be supported. We say that they should have the same rights as everyone else. That's a fundamental importance here, that they should have the same rights. And when we're talking about, for example, the views on vaccinations and such things, you know, what is the recommendation is changing over time. And in the beginning of the pandemic, there were some recommendations which were very strong, and now things are changing, right? In any case, it looks like the United States to some extent, that Swedes are to a large extent like the Democrats. They don't like the right-wing party, and they don't like the anti-vaxxers, and they support the right to abortion, right? But and it's true for the Sweden Democrats thing, because the longer you go to if you have a political scale going right to left, the more you go to the left, the more people will dislike the Sweden Democrats. No surprise there. But the resentment against anti-vaxxers and those who object to abortions, the right to abortion, they're spread out all over the left-right spectrum. So it's not as the same thing as in the United States, even though it may look like that. In any case, after you point out who you dislike the most, you say to what extent are you ready to withdraw the rights for that particular group? And here are the results for that. Expressing views in speech and writing, 21%. Arranging demonstrations, 34% said that you could withdraw that right for the least group, light group. Starting an organization, 38%. Working in the hospital, in elderly care, 44%. And then being a candidate for the Riksdag, 45%, and becoming the Prime Minister, it's a very high number, 64%. Think that if that person belongs to the disliked group, that person should not have the right to become the Prime Minister. We're worried about that, because this is a very high number. Then we take the other side of the coin, self-censorship. Because self-censorship is the same thing, but applied to yourself. To what extent are you trying to shut yourself down because you're worried that people will react to what you're saying in a very negative way. And this is very interesting because in the United States, sorry, in the United States, in the 50s during McCarthyism, the level of self-censorship was around 13%. And now it is around 50 to 60%. The number of people who say that they are careful about or stop themselves from saying certain things because it will create too much of a negative reaction. So 50 to 60% in the United States today, and we were expecting something like in the order of 20% in Sweden. But in Sweden, it turned out that the number is actually 53%. So to the question, in today's political climate, I cannot openly express my views since others may be offended. So agreeing completely or partially is 17 plus 37, so 54%. So that is something which we worry about too. I mean, of course you have to, I mean, self-censorship to some extent is about politeness. You don't just go out and say things. Nihilists tried that in Russia a long time ago and didn't work out. You couldn't have them on dinners because they were telling people very straight up what they were thinking about them. But this is a worrying number, that so many people are thinking this. And we know from the United States that young people are mostly afraid or mostly self-censoring themselves when they're interacting in social media. And the university areas are a particular problem there. Now, all these things are connected to what we talked about here today, namely safety. Because the way you feel safe or threatened, vice versa, is something which has a strong impact on the democratic attitudes which I just mentioned, and also to some extent on the propensity to support defense. And when it comes to this, we ask people about if they perceive there was a change in safety in Sweden during the last decade, and 87% said that was true, that insecurity had gone up to a high degree or to some degree. This is something which we discovered here. It hadn't been measured like this before, but we feel that this is important. And where do these threats in society come from? Well, you have, of course, environmental degradation, but that is the number 2. But I want to say this first. We just had an election, as you know, in Sweden, and the Green Party only received 5% of the vote. So you will get the impression from that people don't care about the environment. But that is not true. People care very much about the environment. They were extremely worried about, especially young people. But there's something wrong with the Green Party, of course, if I may express it that way. We can talk about that later if you want. Economic crisis, 23%, probably going up now. We are repeating these measurements, but this is what happened before the invasion of Ukraine. Epidemics, 43%. But then the highest threat comes from open violence and attacks outside the home, like sexual harassment, robberies, and bombings by organized crime groups, and shootings, which in Sweden has been on an unprecedented rise. Sweden stands out from the rest of Europe in a completely unique way, the way that the level of open violence has gone up since 2015. Terrorism is not that high anymore, used to be higher. Immigration was 37%, we were worried about that. And Sweden being threatened by foreign power, 23%. We are remeasuring this now to see what has happened after the Ukraine invasion, of course. So, final point, the model that we're working with, very simplified, is like this one, that you have threats, and this affects political tolerance and trust, which is also a building block for having a stable democracy and providing effective crisis management, for example, which we have written about before. And this impacts on democracy and defense capacity in a profound way. So this is something we're watching closely, and we should keep this in mind, that the important message is that having a dialogue or discussing security is not only about just preparing about preparedness and having the resources to counter certain threats and so on. It's also about saving that democratic mindset of the people at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Actually, your presentation reminded me a little bit about two things. First of all, we have a really complex societies. Complex societies that are aware of what threatens them. And should we see it also as statistics, as a kind of an information for government, or should we also see it as a kind of a, let's say, opportunity? Because it's from the quote that you put on the presentation, it rests with us to improve matters. And what we found out in the civil protection sector is that we have to engage society as they know what threatens them, and we need to engage them in building resilience against the threats they're prone to. And from my perspective as a representative of the government, this challenge between security and freedom is a very difficult one. And I remember the beginning of the pandemic in Poland, when actually the society was united. I mean, the government put a lot of restriction at the beginning of the pandemic, but the society understood. The problem is that the longer the pandemic lasted, the more difficult it was to explain to the society why we are taking care of their security, and actually we have to find a balance between the security and the freedoms. And it's a very difficult challenge for the government, which is also aware of the value of the freedom of people. And let's stay within the world of academia. Professor Zbigniew Lasocik is conducting research in the field of criminology and human trafficking. For me personally, the issue of human trafficking was also underestimated until the refugee crisis arose in Poland because of the Russian war in Ukraine. My institution was tasked to coordinate transport of millions of refugees that came to Poland. And actually, I was thinking, okay, it's a big challenge, but we can manage to arrange buses from different institutions, from private sectors. We used almost all our buses in the fire service to conduct transport operation. But already at the preparatory activities before the crisis started, we were made aware, beware of the human trafficking. It's something that still exists even in Europe, even in the 21st century. It is a big challenge, and you have to have all the planning, how to control the transportation, control what's going on, and not only transport. It's not about just picking up people. It's a definitely more complex issue. And Professor, so how do you see all the challenges to security from your perspective, and what are the ways to be better prepared?
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank organizers for invitation. Also, what you said makes me thinking that it's very good, and you are lucky that you didn't ask me to talk about my experience at the border, Polish-Ukrainian border, because I would probably stop on Friday. But since I have only a few minutes and I was asked to talk on other issues, so I will refer to that. But for those interested, I will be very happy to share my Polish-Ukrainian experience. But yes, I saw many firefighters helping those who were escaping from Ukraine. But to place my reflections in the context, I would refer to very simple and beautiful sentence which comes from UN report on environment back to 1987. It says that there is one earth and there is many worlds. And I will refer to that in the meantime and also at the very end. Yes, I was asked to talk about two problems. First is what kind of threat is created by human trafficking and forced labor. And then the second, to reflect on international cooperation. And I will do my best to stick these two issues. Normally, when we talk about human trafficking, we emphasize two perspectives, legal and human rights. We say that human trafficking is very serious crime or felony, and human trafficking is violation of human rights. It's very comfortable, also for the governments. But we tend to not to remember that there are three other perspectives. Human trafficking is also sort of the blackest side of migration. People want to migrate, people have to migrate, and criminals expect them, and they benefit from their trauma, their very difficult situation, and many governments do nothing to protect them. The second perspective is perspective which we can call economic. Forced labor creates advantages and disadvantages at the labor market, at the market in general. And the third perspective, we may say that human trafficking is sort of blemish, or I don't know, a sin of our civilization, which at the level of declaration is very much based on humanity. Where is humanity vis-a-vis human trafficking? Europeans, as you rightly said, also Poles had problem to understand the seriousness of human trafficking. And when we say to Europeans that human trafficking or forced labor may be next door, they don't believe that. But they tend to forget that we have, according to the last estimations, we have 6 million slaves or victims of human trafficking in Europe, in our cultural region. To illustrate what I understand by threats, I will give you 4 examples. First, in April 2013, the factory building collapsed in Dhaka, Bangladesh. 1,000 people died, over 2,000 heavily injured. The workers didn't want to get into the building because they noticed the cracks on the walls. But they were forced to get into and work. But the question is, were they deprived of liberty, heavily beaten, or intimidated? No, they were simply assured by the organizers of the work that everything is fine. On top of that, they were told that that's their moral duty to work, and they entered and they died. Second example is Polish labor camp in southern Italy in 10 years ago, more or less. For 2 years, there was a network of Polish camps, labor camps in southern Italy. And they were very successful. Why? Because local police was corrupted by the gang. Only thanks to intervention of Carabinieri, the trauma of these people got to the end. Next case, Europe needs cheap labor. Fine. What criminals do? They offer services and they smuggle people to Europe to serve those who need service. That's another example where there is space for human trafficking. And then last thing, 2015, 2016, the huge wave of migration to Europe. After some time we Europeans realized that we are missing over 10,000 kids. 10,000 children disappeared during this crisis. And all European governments, in fact, violated standards which we are now talking about, societal security or human security. I can give you many examples of how human trafficking can make threat for our security, but I will stop here with this, only saying that human trafficking for sure undermining the development. That's the main thing which we don't see. That we can give excellent examples, even more radical than I did it. But the most important thing that human trafficking is undermining the development of the society. Cooperation, few words about cooperation, I still have a few minutes. In the theory of human trafficking, we say that two approaches are important, holistic and proactive. None of them is very successful when you look at the practice, the theory and the practice. Holistic approach is, at the very international level, holistic approach means international cooperation. This cooperation, and we have to remember that, is legal obligation, because it is mentioned in many treaties, and it comes also from judgments, important courts like European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which in case Renchev against Cyprus and Russia stated clearly that there is such obligation. But is this international cooperation any good? No, it is not. Again, simple proof. The nearest estimation of human trafficking victims is 50 million around the globe. And how many victims we manage to identify at the same globe, Earth or world, if you like? 100,000. This shows the scale of the problem and our incompetence in combating with this problem. Why there are such difficulties with international cooperation? Long list, very quickly. Languages. Officers in many countries in Europe, they don't speak other languages. I'm not saying about Finland. Finland is as a leader in that. People speak everywhere, speak very good English, for example. Law. Legal regulations do not allow to cooperate between law enforcement. To create so-called joint investigation team is very difficult. Institutions don't trust each other. They don't trust at the national level, but what to say about international level? There is reluctance to share information, and especially intelligence. Intelligence is either very delicate or fragile, or it's very expensive. Why should I share? Do they share with me if I would need that? And so on and so forth. Another reason, money. International cooperation costs money. There is no money for this activity. Simple human reluctance to do more than I'm expected. People are lazy and they don't pay attention. And at the very end, lack of political support from the governments. And let me refer to one example to show you where we are. To Poland. This is my country, I can say, I can use this for the discussion. Poland spends on combating human trafficking equivalent of 270,000 euros. Okay? Due to the fact that Poland refused to suspend the coal mining in Turów against Czech complaint, the Court of Justice of European Union Court of Justice imposed a fine on Poland in the amount of 500,000 euros a day, which is double as we spend on human trafficking as a country in the middle of Europe in 21st century. I know Poland can be pointed out as a very bad example, but still, we are in the same continent. And there is extra reason why there is no good international cooperation, because cooperation lacks leader. And I'm very sorry to say so, but European Union, who was supposed to be a leader, is not playing this role well, or not at all. Okay, so let's, to finish, let me come back to the sentence about the Earth and the world. It was very easy when we realized that the Earth is dying. We stood up and then we managed to initiate actions. This conference is a very good example. But it took us some time to wake up. With human trafficking is completely different way, because to human trafficking, the second part of the sentence applies. Many worlds. And the worlds do not see each other. They don't respect each other. They don't cooperate. They don't want to be together on the same earth. And that's why when we needed many years to wake up to save our earth, I would say that we don't have victims of human trafficking. They don't have that much time. So we have to wake up very quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I really like that you mentioned the value of the international cooperation. Actually, I believe that there is an added value coming from international cooperation in combating almost all security challenges. But when it comes to the human trafficking, actually international cooperation is the core of success in this area. So thank you very much. And Līga, you represent the business, or more exactly you come from the digital sector, from which the societies are now more and more dependent, I would say. Continuity of almost all societal services is dependent and guaranteed only if the cyberspace is secure. List of threats in the virtual world is even much wider. And how do you see all these issues from your perspective?
Thank you very much. Demonstrating technology and knowledge. Okay, all right. I'm demonstrating international cooperation. So, thank you very much for having me on this panel. It's my pleasure to be here in a region very near and dear to my heart. Before I joined Microsoft, I was a civil servant in Latvia for many, many years. So my knowledge of the region, I think, is also adequate in that sense. But I'll get to the region a little bit later. In observing the previous two speakers, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, all of these topics have something to do with technology, but it's the platform on which we work, rather than perhaps the threat itself. But the threats that you see to society, the economic crisis, human trafficking, all of these have some sort of element of technology. So the responsibility falls on the sector, the private sector, who develops this technology to figure out how we work in line with democratic values and practices. And at my job at Microsoft, we work on all of these things quite actively. I'm based in Brussels. I do work in European government affairs, which means that mostly I focus on European regulations and how that influences Microsoft as a company. But alongside also the regulatory measures, we look very much on how the world is changing due to geopolitics and how security and defense is changing in this region, across Europe and the world, and how technology is both contributing to conflict, but is also a solution to conflict. So my specialty is definitely more in the realm of cybersecurity, and I'll speak to what I know more in that sense. Although there are dream examples of what we do on responsible AI, on supporting organizations like the International Red Cross, and trafficking, migration, and these kind of issues. But one thing that I was looking at your statistics about what people consider threats, and there was no threats from cybersecurity, threats to their online identity. And so I was very surprised, and I thought, well, is society really under threat from cybersecurity? We very much focus on regulations so that information online can be accurate with different types of platform regulation. We focus very much on the security and resilience of critical infrastructures so that they cannot be attacked by cyber means. But what happens to the people in this kind of situation? So how do we focus on raising the awareness that's necessary for users, for customers, for citizens, so that society feels safe? That sounds like Sweden feels pretty good about their cyber threats, but maybe I'm jumping to conclusions there. But in any case, let me just address 3 different kind of points. One is that if we question how technology is used and the positives and the negatives, we can look at how should cyberspace be controlled in the interest of societal protection, and also how the free flow of information is both a good and a bad thing. And I'll also have a few recommendations for the region. So on cybersecurity, we've learned many, many things from the Russian aggression in Ukraine. It was well publicized that Microsoft was one of the companies that worked very closely with the Ukrainian government to mitigate many cyber threats that were present before and after the actual physical invasion. And one thing that was very critical was that Ukraine had to decide what to do with its data. So governments had, the Ukrainian government, until the war started, had a national law saying all data remains in Ukraine. And that was a very firm decision by the government based on what their population felt was the right way to go with data. But as soon as these threats started in cyberspace, they quickly decided that in this circumstance, where territorial integrity and their own data centers were under threat, and they were also quickly bombed as one of the first targets of critical infrastructure, they changed quickly their legislation in a time of war to move their data. So what does that mean for cybersecurity? One of the biggest things that we discuss at Brussels is what does digital sovereignty mean? And for Europe is at a very critical stage to figure out how they use technology in a way that makes sense and how they manage the risks in cyberspace, which have different concerns for economic reasons, privacy reasons, and also security reasons. So many of the regulations that are on the table now will have to do with data. So how do you get people interested in what happens with their data? And this very much comes to a lot of awareness raising, how technology works. And so you have to figure out who's responsible for letting people know how technology works so they understand this quite advanced concept of data, data flows, and the technology behind it. And there, as a company, we try to make security built in with absolutely everything, taking into considerations the highest level of security regulations, privacy regulations, and also for the economic benefit of any of our users. But it's still not enough. There's still, it's very difficult for people to control their own online identity and how they access information online. So how do we bring these big regulatory concepts and issues on cybersecurity down to the user when people, who are you saying people are lazy? People can't be bothered to change their passwords. So how could we expect them to understand the complex, space that they're putting in all their information and how they can best make use of it? So we do try to do all we can to have, zero trust when we go into different kinds of companies. How do you make the decisions that every user has to make not based on them trusting their computer, them trusting the service, them trusting the guy in the next office who they might pass information to? So how do you make those walls put in place? So those are the kind of things that we work on constantly to try to reduce the stress on each particular person who may be lazy or just we're focusing on something else or whatever the obstruction is. And also working on educating governments about the technology we provide, how we make it, and how we build responsibility and democratic values into it. That's a little bit more about cybersecurity. It is my job to promote global data use, but it's not necessarily what I'll talk to in detail. Anybody needs me, catch me afterwards. I did want to talk a little bit about disinformation. I know there's some skeptics maybe in the room. Anyway, I also wanted to touch on disinformation, since I think that's one of the things that is also a huge societal threat these days, and the role of technology that's makes, you know, freedom of speech online very much possible. And I've gone through watching how different kinds of platform regulation address disinformation from the Brussels perspective, and it's there's no shortage of regulation on social media and on different information platforms. And we've noticed also that, unfortunately, it's journalists who are under attack. The basic concept of journalism is degraded over time. So we've worked globally also to protect journalism's, their online protections, making sure that journalists have the ability to use technology and their own security in that space to the maximum extent. But that's just one area where we work in as well. Disinformation as such, we've recognized that other big tech companies have different ways of using information. We're not necessarily a social media company, so we don't focus on actual content, on really controlling content. We think of ways to try to support those providing content or provide more awareness for where content comes from. Thus, we work with organizations like NewsGuard, who try to identify online where sources come from. If a newspaper says that it's a British newspaper, but its headquarters are in Moscow, then we make that apparent with the help of NewsGuard, which provides different kinds of journalistic integrity points as a plugin on your browser. So that's another example. And we also do a lot to work on electoral integrity. Disinformation definitely is a focus when electoral cycles are in play, and working with political candidates, all political candidates, so that their offices and their campaigns have the best possible protection as far as email integrity and these kind of things that certainly played into the 2016 elections in the US is something that we've also been working on. But there's much, much more we can do. We're working on how disinformation coincides with cyber attacks. Again, coming back to Ukraine, we've definitely noticed that a disinformation attack often preceded a cyber attack, which preceded a physical attack. And we've tried to map that in Ukraine and use these kind of techniques that we've noticed how these kind of attacks coincide to see how we can help other regions of the world. We've also been able to use more sophisticated methods of tracking disinformation and how different information gets planted in different parts of online resources to try to have more insights on how technology can track the actual technical background of how disinformation is spread. So next week we'll be coming out with a rather large report about our digital defense report, so you can look for what Microsoft is saying next week about these things in more detail. The last thing I wanted to mention is, what can Baltic Sea region do? I'm not sure how I am on time, I'll just try to make some quick points. I think the Baltic Sea, I'm very biased, but I think the Baltic Sea region is doing very well. If you look globally on how issues on disinformation, hybrid warfare, strategic communications, cyber defense are being addressed, we are in the region where these things are addressed with the highest level of political attention. You have, in Helsinki, you have the Center of Excellence on hybrid threats, or threats or warfare threats. We have in the CCDCOE in Tallinn, which is the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. As well, in Riga, we have the Center of Excellence on Stratcom. The Swedish have a very interesting, I think, approach from the government perspective on addressing kind of a holistic approach to disinformation and how that affects society. This region is doing very well in that sense. What we can do better is, as a block of countries who put extreme high level of importance on this kind of societal security, first of all, in the EU, vote as a bloc, do more as a bloc. There are other areas of Europe who have different interests, who don't recognize these kind of threats and vote differently. But as a bloc, the Baltic Sea region area at the EU could be doing more. I think there's other great examples, such as the Copenhagen Pledge on Technology for Democracy that the Danish Ministry of Ministry of Foreign Affairs put forth at the UN General Assembly 2 weeks ago, also to promote technology and democracy and working on human rights and democracy in the space of technology. So inviting and having 110 different organizations and governments working together for various principles on connecting technology to democracy. I think these lists go on. I've got a few other examples. But in any case, there's much, much more that we can do by combining the resources of the governments in this area, private sector, and academia to combat the various crises that are focused on digital and societal problems. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. We are joined today also by Jari Honkanen. Actually, both me and Jari know each other very well for already some years. We are both representing civil protection sector, so the sector that comprises rescue services, but also other cooperating authorities that act together on the scenes of emergencies. But at the same time, civil protection sector is engaged in assessment of emergencies, assessment of risk, preparedness, and to some extent also the prevention of emergencies at very different levels. Jari, additional burden was put on us, on our sector in recent years. How can we tackle all the challenges?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. How can we tackle? I got the question, what are the challenges and how do we tackle them? And I talk from the point of view of rescue services in Finland, but I think many of these thoughts that I share, many of our authorities, not just in Finland, but also in other countries can share and feel the same pain. And I think the main challenge for all authorities is the rapidly changing world. Like we've heard here from the previous speakers and in the opening speeches, the environment and societies change so rapidly. And the last few years they've been extreme. First we started with the climate change and the extreme weather conditions. Then came Corona, the pandemic, and now we have the war in our neighborhood. And as consequences of these trends of these occasions, we see also economical problems and disruptions. And that everybody of us can see, every European can see the high prices of gas, electricity, traveling, food, benzene and so on. So it touches us all. And these trends cause polarization and insecurity in our society. And I see this as one of the main challenges for us authorities. We see in our people that they are dividing into those who manage, get well on, who hardly see the change or the higher prices. But then at the same time we see people who barely can manage from the everyday costs. And at the same time we see in countries that have radicalization and confrontations between different societal groups, like we heard from the presentation of the professor. And even solid democratic societies, we see how the extreme movements attract citizens more. And the truth can be simplified. And then when the elections come, the politicians, they are fishing for votes. And these trends often strike them who are already in a weaker position. Like our senior citizens, or people who are working in lower income occupations, but the changes also strike our children, the youth and young adults who are just beginning their own independent life. Another challenge for authorities is to share reliable information, facts, before the social media does it. And giving right-time information is much easier, or being one step ahead of social media, than to start to repair the possible misinformation or the false information given or spread in the social media. And the real-time information, or the expectation that the authorities are also giving and sharing information 24/7 for whole society, that is actually a new demand as well. We authorities, we tend to be a little bit stiff, and we wanted to be sure what we put or what kind of information we give, and we were a little bit behind of social media and media at all. So that is one of our big challenges. Here in Finland, authorities have managed to keep the reliability in the eyes of our citizens. And we have every 2 years a question where people are asked how much we Finns trust on certain authorities. And the numbers are very high. When it comes to law enforcement, or those who are writing laws, they have more than 90% support and trust from the citizens. And the same high numbers are also, they go for defense forces, for police, and for us rescue service authorities, or rescue branch as well. But now the ongoing trends that I mentioned before, like the polarization and populism, they are challenging and questioning these fundamentals that actually are, that our society is based on. And the challenge for us authorities is to find answers to the questions such as how do we take in consideration the societal changes in action, not just in talks and speeches? And how can we reach and convince those who are in difficult situations and circumstances? And what do we have to do to earn the high respect of our people also in the future? Now I come to the role of the Minister of the Interior, what we do to tackle the challenges that I mentioned. And one word is strong cooperation. And how do we do that? First, we of course need to recognize all those partners, stakeholders, whoever they are. They can be, or they are citizens, NGOs, voluntary organizations, they are the private business, and they are the education, innovation, and then of course the respective authorities. And then when we have recognized the partners, then we have to get to know each other, who we are, what we do, what are our mandates, and what are our agendas, what are we aiming at, and what values each of us does have. And the better we know each other, the less we have prejudice and presumptions of each other. And it is important that we engage the relevant partners right from the beginning, that we haven't, as authorities, we haven't done something almost to the end, and then we find the idea, okay, we should have asked some NGO or some company. No, then we have lost them already, because all the partners, they want to be there and influence on the common topic right from the beginning. And when we do that, then we walk the trip together. We learn to know each other, we learn to speak the same language, and we learn to understand each other much better. And when we work shoulder by shoulder, we grow closer, and we learn to respect each other, and we learn to trust them. And that of course goes vice versa, not just that others need to win our respect, and trust. It is vice versa relation. And I think that trust is the essential basis for active and fruitful cooperation. It creates an environment where the partners can give their best. Although we have different roles and mandates, we all are important in our roles. And in cooperation, no one is less important than the other one. The structure and the model that I'm now describing and what we try to do in our everyday life, we didn't build it overnight. The first steps for this kind of cooperation started already in 1880s, so more than 130 years ago. A characteristic structure in cooperation in Finland is what we call the comprehensive security or all society security, kokonaisturvallisuus, yhteiskunnan kokonaisturvallisuus. And what comes to safety and security, civil protection and civil defense issues, there the Minister of the Interior acts like I just described with these steps. A very practical example in the civilian is the civilian material support to Ukraine. In late February, the government of Finland gave the task to coordinate the civilian material support to Ukraine to the Minister of the Interior, to our Department for Fire and Rescue Services, and it was then addressed to our unit, EU and International Affairs. And immediately we established a coordination group where we invited those partners, stakeholders that I mentioned. We have 6 ministries, National Emergency Supply Agency, which is Huoltovarmuuskeskus in Finnish, and then the Confederation of Finnish Industries and Chambers of Commerce, and these both represent the Finnish companies, more than 15,000 companies both. And then we have from the NGOs, voluntary organizations, the Finnish Red Cross, Finn Church Aid, Finnish National Rescue Association, and the Union of Contract Fire Brigades. And then we have, as a logistic, we have the Post of Finland. And of course, all of these, they have their own networks. This network finds and collects the donations around the country from Lapland down to here, South Finland. And our ministry is coordinating and works as a bridge towards the European Union civil protection mechanism. That the donations are delivered to Ukraine. And without one another, it would be very difficult to support Ukraine. But this network makes it possible. And when we talk about societal and civil society security, as the last remark, I would like to highlight the role of individuals and citizens, because a well-prepared, not fearing citizen is the very fundament of a resilient society. So I think the citizen is the first step in our common resilience. And then come the authorities. Especially in times like this, there are huge and scary things going on. And our citizens might feel need to do something themselves and get prepared. In this individual preparedness, it is important that the authorities answer to the needs of our people by sharing fact-based, relevant information and guidance. When these are given in normal time, as a part of the normal responsibilities, citizens have time to get acquainted with the arrangements. And they know how to act in exceptional situations. They know what to do, and emergencies, whether they are man-made or caused by nature, natural disasters. In this preparedness of citizens, I see a perfect match and a good example of cooperation when the authorities provide facts, information and guidance for the voluntary organizations and citizens. The voluntary organizations and associations support the citizens further with practical details and facts. And when these different actors work well together, it provides the resilience from individuals to communities and the whole society. I'd like to ask all Finns, raise your hand up, please. You are some, okay, keep your hand up. How many of you know the 72 hours? And if you don't, then lower your hand. Keep your hand up if you know what is 72 hours. And how many of you know what is the omavara, which is the, how to translate into English, it's the personal supply, emergency supply. So you see, our neighbors and colleagues, you can see that it is well known among the Finns. Thank you.
Kiitos, Jari. Dear colleagues from Finland, you could be really proud of what Jari and his sector is doing. Actually, a few keywords that come for me from your presentation. The very first one, what you also underlined, is to engage relevant partners. The other keyword is a coordination. And actually, you have a very clever network of coordination of these matters in Finland. So congratulations in this. And thank you also very much for putting this attention on citizen. Then comes the authorities. Our decisions cannot be separated from the citizen. So thank you very much that we are looking also on this perspective. Okay, colleagues, we already engage part of the audience to some extent, but I would like to engage also all others. So we have some time for the questions coming from you. So I encourage you to ask our delightful speakers. Yes, there are some questions in the middle. Yep. We'll distribute mics. Just raise the hands again, yeah, so we can distribute. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Tarja from Lappeenranta. I'm local, and I would be happy to know who you are. I didn't find your name in the paper. I met this professor from Warsaw University, but the rest of you, can you please introduce yourselves? I'm sorry, but I would be interested to know that.
Okay, let's do it very quick. Let's do it very quickly. So Adrian Bucałowski, representing Fire Service of Poland.
And my name is Sten Widmalm, and I work at the Department of Government at Uppsala University in Sweden.
Zbigniew, Lasocik. I am a criminology and law professor. I teach criminology and human trafficking at Warsaw University.
Līga Rozentāle. I'm based in Brussels for Microsoft on European government affairs.
And I'm Jari Honkanen from the Ministry of the Interior, Department for Fire and Rescue Services, Unit for EU and International Matters, Affairs.
That was the easy question. Okay, we are counting on more. Okay, here.
Good morning. I would like to introduce myself. I work for Gdynia Maritime University, and I also represent the EU project called European Network of Non-Territorial Autonomies. And I was very interested when I was listening to all those presentations. I would like to raise a question concerning social minorities. That is my interest. I will have the presentation next panel. So I would like to ask, especially, I am thinking about national minorities and ethnic minorities, and my question, two questions. My first question is, what is the real, the exact influence of those minorities for societal security? Are they dangerous or not dangerous? And the second question is, what should be recommendations for the governments concerning those minorities? Thank you.
Okay, any of the colleagues would like to respond to this question?
I don't think the question was necessarily of me, but I'll take a first stab while the rest of the panelists think. I think in regards to any minorities or any people in general, from my side I would say that technology should be developed so it's neutral towards any user. So that there is no specific, if you think about facial recognition, let's say, maybe that's not exactly what you're talking about. But one of the difficulties that was recognized with facial recognition in trying to use it for some sort of surveillance means, which is not something that Microsoft supports in any case, and we can go into those kind of details, but is that facial recognition was tested on white males. And when there were outliers on that, there were inconsistencies, and there were also you falsely could identify people with facial recognition with technology that was not adapted towards different kinds of people in different parts of the world. And so when you're looking at these kind of things, and you think about different ways towards accessibility and use of technological products, whether it's towards people with limitations, with different kinds of faces, with different skin color even, there should be ways to find use of technology that's neutral towards the user in that way. But others may have different views.
Thank you very much. May I? Yeah. Very interesting and very difficult question. Poland is quite a unique country. We have very few and very small minorities. So this issue in Poland is a little bit different in many other European countries. But this, to answer your first question, the minorities can create problems, and it happens. But at the same time, surprise, surprise, they may help to see problem. And Ukrainian refugees are a very good example. And this what happened to Poland is a very good example that this minority, because they are not formally minority in Poland, but since there is a lot of them, and the escape from war country created or alerted us, and we try to create new system, better system to protect people. As moderator mentioned, problem of human trafficking was raised for the second or third time after the war started. So it is mix of problems related to minorities vis-a-vis security.
If I may supplement, actually, whenever we start any activity related to civil protection, we'll try to find out vulnerable groups, especially vulnerable groups. And yeah, that's right, national minorities might be among these vulnerable groups. And actually, I was talking to one chief fire officer from one of the Western European countries who found out that there is a great problem with number of fires in a district that was the district of the national minorities. And he told me, I mean, the problem is that they were not, the people were actually not feeling very comfortable with the society, with the general society, the country they live in. They were like separated from the society. They have not accommodated themselves within the society of this particular country. But what the chief fire officer told me was that you have to make step towards these people, you know. It's the country that started visits of the firefighters at homes of these especially vulnerable people, you know, to tell them that there are authorities that want to help them, to provide them with a smoke detector, to check whether any other electrical equipment is up to date. So the best solution to make them aware about the risk and how to react to the risk was to actually make this step towards them, not to wait, until they contact you. Just be the first one as a government or another authority that want to support.
I could also answer to that. I don't have a direct answer right now, but the question is very good. And since our population is aging, so we are lacking in very near future of labor. And I know that there are good examples from Germany and from UK, where the newcomers or people who have moved to these countries, or who are from a different ethnic background, they have been offered to participate, or they have been encouraged to access, for example, voluntary fire brigades. And I think those are examples that we should take in consideration when we try to answer this lack of labor.
Let's accommodate another question, as we have just a few minutes left.
Hello everybody, my name is Raita and I work in the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health. Thank you all the panelists and the chair for the great panel session. I would ask to Uppsala, Sweden especially, that there was this phenomena in the recent parliament elections in Sweden where, to my ears, I first time heard in the Nordic countries that there is this new party who claimed that there's been miscounting or misuse of the votes. Like, what have been the reactions of Swedes to these claims, and how do you see these claims and what kind of effect they have on the society?
Okay, thank you. In the Swedish party universe, we have all the ones gathering mainly in the middle, and then you have the newest. One of the newest parties is the Sweden Democrats, further to the right, but still participating within the framework of democracy. And but now the newest addition here is the party called Nuance, which is mainly focusing on gathering votes within the immigrant community, and it has very traditional views on women's rights, and its members are openly anti-Semitic, for example. And so a lot of people fear that this will stir up a lot of conflicts, of course. About the same way as people have fear that the Swedish Democrats would do the same, of course, because they have been objecting strongly to immigration and other issues as well. But it's a new party, and they are getting into the municipalities only. They're not sitting in the Riksdag. So, but this is a change, and I think that the general thing you can say about Sweden is becoming more and more like Europe since we entered the EU, actually. So there are many ways that we are just starting to look like the rest of Europe, but Sweden Democrats and Nuance would be two parties to keep an eye on, because you have polarizing forces there that could get out of hand. And I just want to say one thing in relationship to the theme here today. When we talk about natural disasters and pandemics and such things, these are types of crises which can actually bring people together and build trust among members of society. But the kind of crisis that we can see with relating to violence and organized crime, that's a very, very surely the kind of conflicts and crisis that divides people and has a tendency to make people retreat to their own group. So you get more of an atomized and segregated society. And that is the biggest challenge, I would say, in Sweden now, to break segregation, but there's absolutely no way that that is happening right now, that they're actually combating effectively strong segregation. We are going towards the situation in some suburbs in France, for example, in some parts of Sweden right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I saw also one more question, maybe probably the last one.
Yes, it's Torbjørn Hofstad from DSB in Norway. And maybe you already answered my question, because I was also, we saw those nice data from Sweden, and in the start of this session, and I was very surprised that the Swedish Democrats was so unpopular. And since you have just been through an election, the Swedish Democrats, in fact, did it quite well in Sweden. So what happened was maybe what you answered the former question, but still.
Can you say the last part? I didn't hear.
The Swedish Democrats was quite unpopular in your data that you showed us, and you have just been through an election in Sweden, and they did in fact quite well as far as I know in the election. So what happened?
What happened question is hard to answer, but I would interpret this as a sign of, I mean, you maybe have heard about, there are two types of polarization you can see from political science perspective in society. You can have ideological polarization, but you can also have effective polarization. So in the United States, in some questions, the Democrats and the Republicans are not that different, but the effective polarization is very, very strong. And the Sweden Democrats are a part of that kind of polarization. So if you look at, if you go out and measure what would be your second and your third preference, not only the first, you take the first, second, third preference when it comes to voting on other parties and so on, if you were forced to, you can see how everything, all the parties from the Center Party to the moderates and so on, and then, Center Party and Social Democrats, and then to the left of that, they have the longer you go to the left, they have strong resentments towards the Sweden Democrats. But it's a very, very particular phenomenon here, because you have this party, it has roots in a neo-Nazi founders, for example. It looks like Italy, the Brothers of Italy, for example. You know, if you go to the background, it's fascist roots. That's true. But if you look at who are the people who've gone over to the parties, in Italy you can see there is a support coming in from people who've been supporting Forza Italia and Lega Nord, for example, and they're not, it's far from the situation where everybody's are fascists, because they're voting for the Brotherhood of Italy. Same thing with Sweden Democrats. They have a core which are scary and criminals, but they also have the kind of rise in support that you're seeing for them comes from fear in society going up, and also the left just abdicating from traditional questions that they stood up for before. This is, to some extent, my own interpretation. So I think that you can actually trace those incentives for those who support the Sweden Democrats, and the Sweden Democrats have understood that they put the finger on something which is very important, and they're not fighting to make themselves more accepted in general within the party system of Sweden, and they are succeeding, because in the last election you could not see them taking that place in negotiations for a government as they are now. But now they're the second largest party in Sweden, so why shouldn't they, right? So this is a tricky situation. Can you actually moderate this party now? And can the same be true for nuance when they come on, when they come in and move up in Swedish elections as well? I'm not sure it answered your question, but some parts at least.
And just a very short word of supplement from Professor Lasocik.
Yes, I'm sorry that I dare to take the floor, but two things. First, I would like to share with you several figures. After war started, there was 6.36 million people coming to Poland. 4.58 million people left. The difference is 1.78. Majority of them stay in Poland. And that was February, March, cold April. I want to inform you that nobody was left behind. Nobody was left without a cup of coffee, tea, blanket, food, and even place to stay in private houses. And I want to pay tribute to Polish society, who I think did very good job as Europeans. Thank you very much.
Professor. I can just agree with what Professor said. When it comes to Ukraine, we're talking about really a whole of society approach, whole of society response to the crisis. And let's make this word, whole of society approach, as a, let's say, conclusion of our panel. Thank you very much. Thank you. Words of gratitude to our speakers. Words of gratitude also to very engaged audience. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the forum.